Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. On this day in 1955, Disneyland opened in Anaheim, California, and became known far and wide as the happiest place on Earth. I thought that's what AppSec was. When visiting AppSec Disneyland, you may or may not find the following rides. Directory Traversal Mountain seems like a gentle climb at first, then it's ... all the way down. SQL Injection Mansion has no scary syringes, but behind those cobwebs you'll notice 1 = 1 in the shadows. Watch out for security vendors in Chippendale's Gadget Coaster. Wait, didn't we just pass another vendor saying the same thing? Must be a Hall of Mirrors in here too. And by the end of Scary Adventures of Security Misconfiguration, you're in a daze. That JSON configuration looked right to you, but red lights kept flashing and a voice screamed about lack of authentication. But fear not. The Walt Disney Company has a bug bounty program, and you know Goofy's attending all those vulnerability management meetings. Gosh, something wrong here. This week, we chat with Brian Glas about securing non-election election systems and his continuing work to educate the next generation of application security specialists. In the news, Kubernetes and SoundBob meet at last. Do you really want to plug that cable into your EV? Don't trust POC code from a hacker, vulnerabilities in industrial IoT, and more. Find your seat, secure your belongings. Remember to keep hands and feet inside the car and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Imperva is the comprehensive digital security leader on a mission to help organizations protect their data and all paths to it. Only Imperva protects all digital experiences, from business logic to APIs, microservices, the data layer, and from vulnerable legacy environments to cloud-first organizations. With an integrated approach combining network, application, and data security, Imperva protects companies ranging from cloud-native startups to global multinationals with hybrid infrastructure. Start a free trial today and quickly protect your web applications at securityweekly.com/Imperva.
Business Security Weekly is recorded on Mondays at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Each week, we address the challenges facing CISOs through our guest interviews, including former and active CISOs. Our news segment is focused on leadership and communication to better help security leaders translate and communicate security risks into business risks. Jason Albuquerque, Ben Carr, Tyler Robinson, and others add their expertise to the conversation. I'm Matt Alderman, and I hope you search for Business Security Weekly in your favorite podcast catcher and subscribe to download our latest content.
Brian Glas has over 20 years of experience in various roles in IT and over a decade and a half of that in application development and security. His day job is serving as assistant professor and department chair at Union University. He helped build FedEx's AppSec team, worked on the trustworthy computing team at Microsoft, consulted on software security for years, and served as a project lead and active contributor for SAMM versions 1.1 through 2.0 and an OWASP Top 10 2017 and 2021. Brian is a contributor to the RabbitV pilot program for election-related technology. He holds several cybersecurity IT certifications and is currently working on his Doctor of Computer Science in Cybersecurity and Information Assurance. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you. I appreciate y'all having me.
Yeah, it's always a joy to talk to you. Previously, we had you here in ASW 197. We're going to get back and talk about some of those same things around educating future generations and the work you've been doing there. But I want to start off talking about this non-electional election system work that you've been doing. So maybe what is that first? That it's a very vague sounding phrase, but what does that actually mean?
So the term non-voting election technology is essentially just that. It is everything not related to the collection or tabulation of votes. So it is all the supporting technology around elections. So it has to do with voter registration databases, election night reporting, a little bit of ballot delivery. What's the other one that's off the top of my head that I can't remember? But anyway, it's that kind of technology. So it's all the stuff around making sure voters know what they can vote for and gets them in and registered, and everything short of actually tabulating the vote.
And when I was doing some research before this, so Congress has actually defined what the election systems are. So you could do a hand wave and say, well, you're everything that's not defined in those rules. But for our listeners out there who are really bored and want to sort of dig into this deeper on the election side, you can go to eac.gov. And they've actually got some stuff talking about election security, what has to happen for those really critical systems. And my sense here is the difference between that and what you're working on. Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Why do you not have the same program for both systems?
Well, so this Rabbit V for the non-voting election technology, the pilot started about 3 years because there was no standard. So the only standard that existed was for voting the tabulation voting election technology. And so all the stuff around it was, we kind of just did what we could. Each state has different certifications at different levels. Vendors now have multiple states that they have to do these different certifications for. There's a couple of testing labs, but they're mostly focused on election technology that deals with the actual votes. And so this was kind of a gap space where we're looking at saying, hey, you can disenfranchise people really easily if you start really messing with voter registration or electronic poll books or election night reporting. So if you start messing with reporting from East Coast, then the West Coast people may not go vote because they don't think there's, won't make a difference. So I won't go vote for something.
So, and that's... It's funny. I think I wouldn't want to say it's more important, but there's definitely a very high level around that. But still, since it's a little less, and some people would say, "Oh, that's just a voter registration database," or "That's just a thing sending out the pamphlets." Is there corners we can cut? I'm going to start with it sounding negative, but where I'm trying to get to is like, do they have to go to that same level of I mean, like I said, if folks go out and look at that website, the level of really the way things have been spelled out of like, this is what you must do, this is what you cannot do, this is when, this is how many people have to be in a room, like everything has been scripted out and made very clear and regulated. And I'm guessing that's not always something that we need or want. So, yeah, related to the votes, so that all there is to have that high level of assurance. Because it's not, I mean, even if, and we've seen this in the last election, all you have to do is create the semblance of doubt. There doesn't even have to be anything wrong with the system. You just have to let people think that there might be. And so that's why all that strict rules exist, but it's more than needs to, in some ways, needs to exist for the non-voting election technology. So that's part of the reason why we started this program, because you don't want to just copy over what was for the election technology or for the actual voting. We didn't want that just straight copied over into the non-voting space. Mm-hmm. So at a high level, and I think I'm going to try and dive down into some of these, we'll see how deeper, but what's sort of the top-down approach of how you guys are actually dealing with this? I can guess from your background with some of the OWASP projects that there's going to be some OWASP feel to this as well. So definitely is. So what happens with the voting related is they're large cycles. So you have this large, heavy certification process. So you don't make changes very often. It's much more waterfall-like. So it takes you months potentially to get recertified. So it slows things down. So it takes a long time for long cycles. Well, with Agile and the current development schemes, we wanted to try and build a process that could do iterative reviews. But to be able to do smaller scale iterative reviews, you need to understand what's the risk of change. So we need to know, because we can't afford to go full soup to nuts certification every time there's a minor change. It's too expensive. Yeah. So we don't do that. So Rabbit V, the original idea when we started the pilot 3 years ago, was how do we have a larger understanding of the overall risk related to a system? So it's not just testing the actual implementation of the system. We go back to the start. And so
OWASP SAMM, I got pulled into this because of OWASP SAMM, so the software assurance maturity model that goes through and attempts to measure the maturity of the processes to develop the software. And so RabbitV is actually a 3-tiered system. So it's in some ways, and who knows, I might get in trouble for saying this, in some ways it's not as stringent as the voting, and in others it's actually more comprehensive. Because the testing for the voting related stuff is all testing the implementation. And it's great level of detail, but it's testing the end product. We're testing 3 different levels, 3 different areas. And so we're testing the organization's capability of creating secure software and then being able to properly manage change. And then we're also testing architecture. So what is your potential for having a good product? Did you design this software well? And then the third part is actually the product verification, which is where you have your traditional testing. So that's where you have like your penetration testing, code review, and that kind of stuff.
So this is interesting to me. We've talked a few times, excuse me, probably first over various episodes, we've talked about maturity models. It's an idea which to me I find very attractive. SAM's great. There's a few other ones out there, but we've always been talking about them from two podcasters going like, hey, these look sort of cool. And, I could say as a manager, I'm using them, but like, this is probably one of the first really sort of, rubber meets the road of like, how do you implement the maturity model around this? How do you measure that maturity around these sort of 3 aspects as you mentioned? I'm not sure how early you were there in that project, but like, can you talk a little bit about like how that was to get it off the ground and like how it's been like to actually sort of try and climb that maturity model?
So it's been an interesting group. So I don't have a huge background in election related technologies. So the group of people that I'm working with, I've learned so much about the process and the community and the folks related to it, with lots of respect for them. And just for how important it is, just in general, to be able to get this right. But I mean, we had a few vendors. So the idea is we can do what we call registered technology providers. We don't call them vendors because a lot of states actually have developed their own systems. And so these state developed systems, they don't sell to anybody, but they still need the same type of verification, the same types of reviews. And so we've worked with, over the last 3 years, we've had 2 phases of the pilot. And we were able to get a few technology providers in a state to actually be willing to take the time to be part of the pilot, where we gave them free reviews, so of the maturity of each of these levels, plus recommendations. So that's one of the other big things in it, is not just purely measurement, but the ultimate goal of RabbitV is not just to tell you are here, but to actually overall improve the industry in that space. So when we go through and we do an assessment, like an organizational assessment, and we do it based off of the SAM model, but we've also enhanced it. There's also accessibility and usability added to it as a separate, we called it a human factor. So it's a 6th business function that we added to SAM. And not only do you get a you are here measurement, but you get custom recommendations. So based on, it would be like a standard SAM assessment that I would do for somebody, but I'll go through and say, hey, this is where you're scoring. This is given your culture, given your space that you work in, given your IT maturity. These are the recommendations for like where to improve and how to get better. Because ultimately the idea is we're developing baselines to say, if you go through the program, like this is your first tier of baseline. If you can cross this line in terms of your scores in the different areas, then you're putting out a good product. And then that baseline will slowly increase over time so that you don't get complacent and you don't just kick back and relax. But ultimately, the goal is to have a continuously improving, more secure election-related technology.
Brian, I'm curious, like, what kind of trends you've seen. Like, have you noticed that maybe states in a particular region tend to have the same problems or things like that?
So the interesting thing is between all of the technology providers we looked at, in a theorize, it's kind of the nature of the software. They're in fairly common places in terms of different types of maturity levels. Some of it also has to do with their organizational size is typically smaller. So they have a lot of common traits due to smaller organizations, a lot more tribal knowledge as opposed to heavily documented, formally documented kind of stuff. Just because with that number of people, you don't have the amount of time to do the overhead to have heavily documented processes and standards and policies because that chews up a ton of time. Once you get a certain size as an organization, you have enough overhead time because there's enough people that you can handle that, but your innovation's nuked if you're spending 20% of your time on documentation, creating and maintaining it. So it's a challenge. Like for me, like I want you to have this stuff documented. You can tell your security story. You can prove to people that you're doing what you say you're doing. But at the end of the day, a certain amount of time can only be spent in that space or you can no longer innovate and produce a product that, people will pay you for.
Hmm.
I don't know if yet. I see a follow-up question coming there, Kara.
I know. I feel that's an interesting. Okay, so that's. I feel like that's like the eternal debate, right? Like, how much time do we spend documenting versus how much time do we spend building? You said like a smaller organization had a little bit more trouble with this conundrum. How small is small? Like, when do you see that tipping point kind of go from we can afford to do all this documenting?
So far from what I've seen, usually I'm theorizing the line is around, when I say smaller, I'm talking about like 50 to 70 people. So when you're down at that small, because of the just inherent overhead that you have, there's only so much time you can spend for documenting. And to be honest, you're not, even if you create the document when you're that small, you're not going to use it because there's enough relationships still. You're at a small enough scale that you can get people together and talk to them. The documentation really has to exist when you start getting too large for these small groups of relationships and you now have these much larger teams. Documentation has to serve as the vessel for that communication between teams. You get turnover, you get people leave. The other thing that's interesting with these groups is they generally are more senior heavy in terms of experience. They don't have near as many junior developers or technology folks. They're generally more senior. They generally have less turnover. Like people come and they work in the same team and they work at the same company for longer periods of time.
Mm. Okay, so it's like it's necessary, but not in the immediate moment necessary.
So
Because you
there's
can
a
just
certain
call Barbara or whoever.
yeah. There's a certain amount you need to have as like a knowledge base so that you can say, hey, why did we make this decision a year ago? Why did we make this decision 2 years ago? Kind of thing. And you build up over time and you say, hey, what did we do the last 3 times we had this kind of scenario? So there's some documentation that you absolutely need to do anyway. But there's some that's just if you had several hundred people, you need more well-documented standards and requirements because no one person can go talk to the other 5 leads and say, hey, this is what we do.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. That makes sense.
So I'm backing up a little bit on that. It's interesting that you're seeing relative maturity across these different teams. Any guesses as to why? Is there? Well, I guess the one I'm interested in. Do you think that's because those teams are talking to each other, or are they working in sort of isolation, or is there a little bit of thought sharing?
So, sorry, in the smaller organizations, there's a tight integration, or at least the ones that we've talked to so far. There's a pretty tight integration. They have a relatively small number of products, and they use common platforms. And so when somebody runs into something, it's not much to go share with the 2 other architects or 3 other architects. You're not dealing with a couple of hundred architects where you're like, all right, we have to have some security center of excellence kind of thing where everyone goes and looks for this common, answers to things or common reference architectures. So it makes it a challenge because SAM was originally built under waterfall for large enterprise. So the questions are still, and we've modified it over time. We're at like 208 or something like that to be more agile friendly, to be more consumable by a wider range. But at the same time, there's still certain activities in SAM that are like, do you have a software center of excellence? For certain size companies, they will never go to that point. It just doesn't happen. And so that's an interesting challenge of trying to explain to people that for your size, you may not have a really high score from 0 to 3, but for your size, you're actually pretty good. Because everyone likes to aim for 3. They're like, we have to be 3. But in reality, you don't have to be 3. You have to be to a point where you're doing a good job. And for different companies, that upper bounds of maturity is a different score.
That's really interesting. You're doing the second thing. You actually just walked into the question I was going to ask. Is like, based off this work you've just seen, is it either validating what you guys have done in SAM, or how is it going to come back and affect it? But that is interesting. I think one of the things I probably said on here in the past is maturity models in general. I think you have to be big enough to understand that maturity exists. And you're sort of dialing that down a little bit further and saying, hey, are dialing it in a little bit further and saying, hey, it's you don't, you could probably say what's a 5 to one group isn't a 5 to another.
Yeah. Well, and so that's one of the biggest challenges. So in the SAM presentations, we like to carry around the quote from George Box that says all models are wrong and some are useful. Because when you try to make a generalized model, it's going to be wrong somewhere for somebody. But the hope is that we can make it useful. And so one of the interesting things that's come out of this is I'm looking at, do we need to create a SAM light? Like if you have less than 100 people, should there be a version of SAM that you use instead of the larger, more enterprise-sized one? Because one of the things with SAM, so you get into the eternal SAM versus BSIM debate if you ever look at the maturity models. And BSIM forked off of SAM back in 2008, right before it was released. And so they have the same foundation. BSIM is mostly used within larger companies. If you look at the average size of the SSG or software security group, it's like 22 people. I ran the FedEx AppSec team and we had 6. I can't fathom having 20 plus AppSec people at my disposal. That's a huge team from my perspective. And so so we try to position SAM as like, hey, you can run maturity model for anybody. You could run a team of 10 against SAM. You just don't aim for 3. You're not going to hit it. And so we get into these other debates are, what about NA? Like not applicable. Can we say some questions or some security activities in SAM don't apply to me? And there are some, and it's fairly isolated, there are some scenarios where it may not apply to you. Like for instance, in SAM, there's some sections about supplier contracts and vendor relations. If you never outsource anything, you never have a vendor contract or anything, then it may not apply to you. But one of the interesting things we're getting into is we're trying to look at, say, hey, what if, because by default, everyone tries to aim for 3 because, that's your upper bounds and you're going to be measured. What if we said, here's our target. So our target for a particular security activity in SAM might be 2. But what we should be measured against is our progress toward our target, not toward 3. So if I'm 1.5 out of 2, then I'm doing well, versus 1.5 out of 3, of which, honestly, if you tried to go to 3, everyone tried to go to 3, it's actually doing them a disservice. You're wasting money.
It's probably becoming security for security's sake.
Yeah.
And you end up hurting your security posture a lot of times if you overdo it. And I always say, it pains me to say that as a security guy, you can overdo security. It doesn't happen often. I've had people ask me, what happens when you go beyond 3 in SAMM? And I'm like, whenever it happens, I'll let you know, because it just doesn't happen. It's so expensive and so time consuming to try and get 3s across the board.
Yeah. So I wonder, is that a conversation a team should have when they're starting to explore SAMM? Of like, in other words, do you sort of baby step along and like, let's just see how far we get? Or, for the manager who wants to be sort of goal oriented, maybe, I don't know, bonuses or just overall goal driven, do you say, we see there's a 3-point score there. We think for our company, I've talked to folks who have experience. If I get to 2, I'm going to be happy. So let's just set that as our goal from the get go.
I think, from my perspective, what seems to be working best is to do that initial assessment. Figure out where you are, and then that helps you put into context the effort you've put into place, what you have running, what activities you have, what initiatives you have, what tooling you have, training, all of that kind of stuff. You can see how it scores. And then you can say, hey, I feel like we could do a whole lot better in this space. So either given somebody's experience or relationships with other groups or technology that they haven't explored yet, at that point, I think it's reasonable to try and set your scoping targets. But I wouldn't try to set them before you ever do your first assessment, because you haven't made the translation. You have no idea how well you're doing in the real world versus what this model says you score. So you have to make that first translation before you try making a target.
Makes sense. I'm going to go back to something you were talking about earlier and sort of move forward with it, where you're talking about a lot of these teams seem like they're a lot of senior folks on there, which it worries me a little bit, because I want to see more junior people out there and getting experience in this. But one of the other hats you're wearing, the day job, I mean, literally for you, is actually helping bringing some of these new folks into the AppSec world and training them. So I'd love to talk about that for a few minutes. Yep. Since we last chatted, you have a new title over there. You're now chair of the, make sure I get this right, for the computer science department at Union. And it sounds like from, when we were talking off air, that's going to give you a little more chance to be, I'm going to say, creative about sort of crafting where that's going to go. It'd be interesting to hear you talk about that a little bit.
So, yeah, it's interesting. So the chair, the only other chair that we've ever had of the dedicated computer science department retired after 30 years of teaching here. So he built a lot of what exists and did wonderful job, wonderful man. Lots of respect for him. I've got big shoes to fill, but from my perspective, I'm excited because when I started 4 years ago, or in 2019, I got the chance to build the cybersecurity program. So that's one thing, to build a program from scratch. So there was no pre-existing stuff. It was just completely brand new. So at the end of this school year, so in the spring of 24, I'll have my first graduates. So I'm really excited about that. But I've had them for 3 years now, 1 more year, and then I get to turn them loose. So that's a lot of fun. But now formally I have the entire computer science department. So I now have the computer science degree program that's under my responsibility as well. And from my perspective, I'm trying to look at everything that students are coming in for. And some are coming in for cybersecurity, and some want to come in because they're really enamored with the concept of game development. Like, they really want to code video games. They grew up with them. Like, this generation, more so than any generation previously, really grew up with playing games. And they want to make more of those. And so
you're going to gamify all the security things.
Potentially. I mean, but to a point, right? So there's a natural competitive nature that a lot of people have, even if they're just competing with themselves. But I've seen gamify go over the top where people just get super annoyed and shut down and they walk away from it.
Definitely. And, one of the things, I know we're sort of getting close to the end here. Akira, I think you actually had a question. Did you want to go back and hit that one up? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I was on mute. My bad. Yeah, Brian. So I work with juniors from time to time. I mentor them from time to time, usually coming out of boot camps, not out of university programs. But there's a lot of trepidation around juniors right now because of all the layoffs that have been happening. And I hear over and over again, like, maybe I made a really big mistake. Like, what if I can't find a job? Like, I'm not sure if you're feeling that from your students, but I'm definitely feeling it from mine. Mm-hmm. I'm curious if you are feeling it from yours, like what kind of words of wisdom you would offer them.
So I do get that from some students where they're kind of worried. They'll hear about all the big layoffs in the industry. They're like, Microsoft laid off this number of employees, Google laid off. The interesting thing, which didn't get talked about in a lot of those news stories, was some of those companies hired 80,000 employees in the span of 2-3 years over the pandemic, and then laid off a fraction of them, like 5 or 10,000. And also back when I was, 10, 15 years ago, that used to be normal. Every year you'd lay off 8 to 10,000 people and you'd refresh the crop, essentially. You try and identify, who wasn't working out as well as you thought, and then you'd hire a new group. And so I've got students that they'll read the news stories and they'll see them and they'll kind of get a little freaked out about it. But at the end of the day, there's still a massive shortage of both security and just in general software development and everything. So part of it, what I try and tell students is part of what you need to look for too is don't only look at like the Facebooks, the Googles, the Microsofts. There's a ton of companies that need this talent. And it might be a local company. We have local utility companies that they have a really important role. They keep the lights on, they keep the water running, they keep the internet running for everyone in our town. They need people too. And so I'm trying to work with them to get internships so they can get some smart people to go over and start working for them. And it just depends. Some students like local, some like remote, but I'm trying to convince them broaden your horizons a bit. Because if you're going to do software development, there's so many different companies that need software developers. When you need security, there are so many companies that need security people. And it's a challenge, especially coming straight out of college with a cybersecurity degree, is a lot of security is having a solid foundation of understanding of how things work. And so even if they'll say, hey, I can't get a security job out of the gate, I was like, that's fine. Go write code. Go be a system admin. Go be an analyst. Go do something. Learn how things work. And you'll get in the security from there. Because you can't just be security and have no underlying knowledge on top of that. You have to understand how things work, which is part of the reason why the cybersecurity degree here is so large, is because almost half of it's computer science. The other half cybersecurity, because you can't just know how to secure things without knowing how they work.
Yeah, you can't possibly not understand networking at least a little bit or coding at least a little bit. And yeah that makes sense. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yep. And I'm guessing there's, not guessing, it's a fact. It's as you were talking about, the pride you're starting to see from these ones you've been educating for 4 years about to sort of go out into the workforce and seeing them sort of go. When those folks hit the workforce, how they get, how they find fulfillment in the job doesn't have to be at, one of 50,000. If you're somewhere local and you're one of 200, and you're actually making a change in your community, that can be a pretty big deal as well. I want to hit one last thing because, man, you're busy. And the other thing we talked about really briefly offline, which I think is super interesting, is this project you're starting to work on around how to sort of centralize or how to standardize analysis. I'll call it, and I'm sure you're going to correct me, analysis and visualization and ingestion of data. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So with all the OWASP work I do, I end up falling into some commonalities. So working with OWASP SAMM, I'm working on the benchmark project, which is pulling in data from different organizational assessments. And again, trying to figure out how you measure up with other people or other organizations that are similar. OWASP Top 10, again, data collection. And so I started realizing that, hey, I've got a bunch of projects that collect a bunch of data, and there's a bunch of other OWASP and open source projects that have data, and it would be really great if they had a place they could go to get support for this. So really recently, I mean, we still have like new car smell. Recently, we started what we call the David project. So it's the data analysis, visualization, and ingestion domain. Yes, the last part is domain because it is really that whole domain, but it also spells David, and that was important. I grew up with FedEx where your acronym either make or break your project, and so acronyms are important. But what we're
Internal
trying to do
is actually super important, but that's a completely separate podcast. Yeah.
So
we had a whole podcast on naming things. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there was a great project at FedEx that was named Vampire. The project itself was brilliant. The executive did not like the name of Vampire, and it died until a different executive came along. There's so many stories about naming and how important they can be. But anyway, so we, Daniel Ting and I are co-leading this right now, and we're in the early stages, but we're basically trying to create an OWASP project that is the data analysis and visualization project for open source projects. And so the idea is to try and create a common framework and a common foundation so that projects can come in and say, hey, we have data. We either need to collect data to make data informed, not necessarily driven, but data informed decisions. We need to try and promote how well our product is working or how well our tool is working. So we have things like OWASP ZAP. So OWASP ZAP has a bunch, the Z attack proxy has a bunch of metrics and data, but they don't really have a standard way to float them out, make them public so people can see how they're being used. OWASP also has ModSec or Mod Security, which is essentially an Apache plugin that operates similar as a web application firewall. Well, AWS actually uses it in some of their main setups. And so the idea is, well, what happens if we can take some of that data and we can start to surface what's going on in that space? What are we seeing? What are we not seeing? In the OWASP Top 10, we see data. Basically, we collect every 3 years. But what if we had a way to have more of a real-time feed or nearer to real-time? Like, what are trends that are happening that you don't wait 3 years to find out about? Now, we may not change the top 10, but you may be able to see what's coming. Like, we can't change the top 10 every 6 months, but we could see, hey, these are trending, and that also helps us determine this might be important to add or adjust in the next cycle.
Yeah. And I think I want to squeeze this in at the end. But if for our folks who are listening, think about how many, well, maybe you don't know, go to the OWASP projects page. There is a ton of projects out there under OWASP. And this concept to me, as soon as Brian mentioned that they're thinking about how do you, even if you're just doing some amount of centralization around this, it's just like it's this, I think this has a ton of potential. So I want to squeeze this in here at the end. We'll have links to these things in the show notes. If folks want to go look, they can go find this out on OWASP directly. David, pretty easy to search for. Now it is there. Thank you for getting that up, Brian. And thank you for joining the show. I really enjoyed the chat, and thank you, Akira. We're going to take a break, and we'll be back with news for the week.